welcome back to my channel. Thank you so much for tuning in. For today's video, I wanted to walk you guys through a portrait study. I wanted to riff off of my last week's video where I walked you guys through how I like to do my warm-up sketches, and this time I wanted to warm up my painting skills, and specifically my watercolor painting skills, because I haven't touched my watercolors in quite a long time. I think it's been several months. I honestly don't even remember the last time I used them. It might have been when I did the clown sticker video. I feel very nervous about using it again, but whenever I do take these long breaks from drawing or from a certain painting medium, I like to ease myself back into it by doing either a study or a master copy. So here's a quick look at the tools that I'm going to be using for today's video. Here is my Strathmore watercolor sketchbook. It is the 500 series. Here are my watercolors, some round brushes, and a mechanical pencil and eraser for drawing the sketch. And here's the reference that I'll be using today. Pretty much all my photo studies start out with a sketch, and I'm going to try and draw in just the 1/4 of the page so that I have room next time for 3 other portrait studies on this single page. Making sure I don't draw it too big. People ask if the graphite underneath smudges when I start putting on watercolor, and it does, but honestly that doesn't bother me. I honestly think when the pencil lines show underneath, it adds more to the painting. I really want to keep this study fairly short. I'm actually going on a trip on Wednesday. So here's the general outline of the face. Now let's go in with the features. I think the drawing is basically at a point where I can run with it, but I want to be absolutely sure that I have all the visual cues that I need in order to express it the way I want to. So yeah, there's our sketch. Here's a closer look at it. It has enough of the details that I need in order to do the painting. The most important thing that I have to keep in mind when I'm painting this will be to keep the area in light as possible, to preserve the white of the paper as much as possible, because once you start darkening the paper with paint, it's hard to get the white of the paper back. So while I'm painting this, I think the most important thing to keep in mind is to be mindful of what is in light as opposed to what is in shadow. So I'm looking at the photo and I'm realizing that another reason why I like this image was because there's a strong sense of cool light on her skin. There are a lot of purples that are showing through, and I definitely want to emphasize that and contrast it to the warmth that is in the light. I can either start with a cool base and then add the warms underneath, or I can start with a warm base and then add cools afterwards. I don't think there's a right or wrong way about it, but once you start something, you have to commit, right? I don't know, I'm really nervous about starting, but I think I will start with the cools. I think I'll start with trying to get some of the purpley tones to show through. Let's just run with it. Oh, I am way too nervous. Well, I'm gonna start with here because that's all in shadow. So I'm just gonna carve out the shadow area from the lit areas. There's a highlight on the other side of the nose, but I think it might be a trick. I think I'm gonna put it entirely in shadow. Not bad. She is rather purple right now, but I'm definitely going back in with some warms. While the paint is wet, I'm going to bring in some of the warms. I have to be pretty quick about this. This may look a little funky to begin with, but I have faith it'll, in the end, when I'm done the painting, it'll look all right. So what I'm doing now is bringing in some of that warmth I was talking about. The under-facing planes are catching the bouncing warm sunlight, and that's why it's warm. And yes, because the paint was wet, it's going to bleed into areas you didn't intend to put there, but that's just the nature of watercolor. And honestly, I think I used to fight it a lot more, but I think that's just the beauty of working with watercolors. And it honestly like does things that I normally wouldn't even have thought of. I feel like the medium just makes me a more artistic person. I'm learning to love and accept the uncontrollable quality of it. Just by putting in some of the warm lights, I feel like it does so much to add sense of planes there. So it's not just like a flat plane all over. Wherever there is that shift in color temperature, there's changing planes. So as I mentioned before, I'm going to be taking a trip this Wednesday for, I think, 5 days or 5 nights, 6 days, something like that. We are going to New Orleans, Louisiana, and I'm very excited. And it's a bit of a long story how we ended up booking this trip. Going in with the shadow shapes of the hair now. Even though I love painting redheads, I'm always nervous going in with red. I find red, like deep red, to be a bit of a tricky color to work with. I find it's really easy to let the colors become really garish when you use a red, so I'm being mindful of that, trying to balance this red color out with some of the blues that I used to bring into the face. But really, when I paint, I'm mostly concerned about the values rather than color temperature, because I feel like I can adjust color temperature as I go. I feel like the neck is a little bit too bright and there's a little bit too much contrast. So I'm gonna knock that down a little bit, because I don't really want your eyes to go to her neck. Now, hair is something I often struggle with, but I've been told to treat it very simply. So off screen here, I'm trying to get the right shade for her color, mix enough of it so that I don't have to go back and mix more, because you'll see that I'm going to try and put it in pretty quickly. Here we go. Oh, I can already tell from that first stroke, it's a little too cool. So I'm gonna go back and add a little more warmth in and maybe gray it down a little bit, because it is in shadow and I don't want it to be too bright. Even though we think it looks bright, it's probably not as bright. Like, the color is probably not as saturated as we perceive it to be, because this is in shadow and it's being affected by the cool skylight. So making sure this outer edge is clean. Try to make these edges down here a little bit undefined. We'll start here. I think that looks good. And I'm gonna just add more water and bring that color up. So again, I want to make sure I preserve that white of the paper that is this side of her face here, because I want that strong contrast. And let's try to get this strip of hair that's coming down. So I'm bringing a slightly cooler red down here while it's wet so that it mixes in smoothly. Let me get the shadow shape here, and it gives the hair some sense of depth. It's not just like a flat sheet on top of her head. And here as well. Stepping away from the picture a little bit and looking back at my reference, there's a desire for me to want to go back in this area and redefine that shape that's been lost a little bit. I feel like maybe it leads us back into her face. As watercolor dries, it will look different from when you first apply it. So it's normal and expected to have to go back to re-emphasize certain things. I want to make sure that I leave that little bit of white in her parting, because that helps really give a sense of form to her head. So I'm being very careful to paint around it. And I want to make sure that I leave this highlight here on the hair so that the hair looks shiny. But in order to do that, I have to contrast the surrounding areas with darker values. I think it looks pretty good so far. But I do think leaving it understated is more tasteful than overstated. Things in shadow, our eyes are not as drawn to it as much, so we pick up less detail in the shadow. So I think we can get away with that simple of a statement. So I'm going to leave it there. I am liking how it's turning out so far. Before we move on, I'm going to bring out the shadow shape here that we lost a little bit. I'm treating it very geometrically because it's just easier that way than trying to figure out like, oh, what's going on there. If I just think of it as, oh, there's like a dark triangle shaped like this here, it just makes it so much easier than trying to, I don't know, rationalize it. I don't know how to put it. And I want to, there's one more thing I want to do before we move on for reals, which is to bring that strip of hair out a little bit more, because I like the shape that it's creating. And I want to define this little curve there, maybe one there. I feel like this area didn't get quite dark enough, so I'm going to wet it and then drop some darker values in there like that, because I don't want any super hard edges there. I think it looks pretty good. Let me just make sure that the ear here is popping out a little bit because it's a little lost right now. I And let's put this one in more of a shadow, make it a little bit darker. Doesn't the face look so washed out now that the hair is in place? So what I have to do is go back to the face and darken it more. All right, I'm gonna leave it there. So I actually just took a small break away from the painting so that I can take a look at it from afar and reassess what needs to get done from this point. And I think the painting looks pretty good from here, and I think it really doesn't need much more to finish it. Obviously, I need to work on her features, but I really think that is all we have to do, and I have to really be careful not to overwork it because I think that would actually take away from the painting. I feel like the statement is already there. I think John Singer Sargent may have said this, but I'm sure other artists also use this method, which is to make one of the eyes in a portrait the kind of focus instead of trying to make both eyes look like they're both in focus, because usually when we look at someone, we're only really looking at one of the eyes. You can have one eye kind of fall back and one eye be the one that has more contrast. And I think in looking at this photo, this eye here is definitely the one that we're meant to look at because there is a little, you know, twinkle in her eye there, as opposed to this eye being a little bit more covered in shadow. And I think probably the final thing that I will do is draw in that shadow shape that is falling across her face here, and also probably indicate a little bit of the texture of her hair, but not go overboard because I really like how the hair is stated right now. So without further ado, let's start working on her features. Like I said, I like how the painting has turned out so far, and I don't want to mess it up. I think the trick is to have a very light hand and stepping away from the painting often to see if it's enough, if that was all that it needed. I think because her features are in shadow, I don't have to bring it to too much of a finish. That saves a lot of time actually. Just bring in some color and some darks. And that's all it may need to read like a nose. Maybe it needs a little more definition here, but I really don't want to overdo it. I don't want it to read like I mean, I want it to read like a nose, but I don't want it to be so literal, if that makes sense. I just want to very delicately suggest it. I really like that very clean shape there, so I don't want to mess with that. I was gonna go into it, but I don't think I will, so I'm gonna back off. There. Bring that intense warmth there from the subsurface scattering. She looks like she's kind of clenching her jaw a little bit, so I'm gonna emphasize that. I will go in with the iris now, but I will go in fairly lightly because I don't want it to just be like two black circles. Start with this eye because it's the less important eye and I can afford to make more of a mistake. I'm gonna be very careful to paint around where I think the white of the eye should be. So I'm gonna protect that like my life depends on it. feel like now that I have that eye in, the skin is starting to look extremely pale. So that's something I'm gonna go into once I move on from the eyes. Off screen, I'm mixing enough paint so I can cover it all, and then going to go in with a very wet brush. So because I want to keep that area cooler, I'm mixing some purple, and we're gonna go in now. And let's not forget this section here. Knock out some edges, hard edges that I didn't want. Actually, while the paint is wet, I'm gonna go in with some warms again to emphasize that, like here. Okay, now I'm gonna let that dry a little bit. Kind of want to knock this white down a little bit because it doesn't need to be that white. Actually, I will go over this entire area while I'm at it. That's the great thing about watercolors, is that I can just go over it with a thin layer if I want to darken its value, and it's not going to disturb the layers underneath. I think we're close, but I think after having gone back in here, some of the details have been lost a little bit, so I'm gonna go back in and bring those back out with some harder edges. A little bit of a harder edge there because that's what I see in the photo. A line there because that's also what I see in the photo, and I'm gonna leave that in. I'm not gonna blend it out because I can. Same with that line. So yeah, I think basically I'm done. Before I finish the picture, I'm actually going to now carefully paint in the light side of her face, and I leave that last because it's easiest to control it that way. I want it to be very light, but I don't want it to be literally the white of the paper. I want it to have some sort of a hue there. So I'm going to make sure my brush is fairly clean and going to go in with the color that I want, which is warm, yellowish, orangey pink. It's gonna be very diluted. I'm not gonna have too much of it on my brush because I want just the faintest little indication of color there, like that. Maybe it's a little too yellow, so I'm gonna go in, mix a little bit of the pink, and I'm just gonna feather it out, just blend it out. I'm gonna bring some greens to her eyebrows because I feel like her face needs just a little bit more of color, and green is a nice complementary color. Yeah, I feel like that's playing nicely against all the reds in the picture. And now I'm really just seeing what else I can do to make the picture better, but being careful to not overdo it. Just bringing out some of the anatomy of the eye, even though it's very subtle. It's subtle, but it does a lot. Now it looks like an eye. I mean, not an eye, an ear. So yeah, I'm bringing some like contrasting colors to certain areas to make it look a little less monotonous. I feel like if you introduce a little bit of the complementary color here and there, it helps the colors sing, but you gotta have a very light hand because if you do that all over the place, and it just dilutes the entire statement. Okay, now I'm gonna bring a little bit of hair texture along this area because I feel like it needs it. It really doesn't need much for the audience to think that this is hair. I think I just need to bring out like a few little creases. Constantly referring back to the reference and picking out what I see and deciding whether it should be emphasized or left out. I think the last thing I will, well, not the last thing, I keep saying that. I think what I'll do is also go back here with some more color so that it looks a little more saturated and darker in value. Now I feel like with more color and more like value here, there's more weight down here now, and I feel like it's like leading us into her face better. Oh, I'm having way too much fun. I feel like I could have stopped like 20 minutes ago, but it's really fun once you get into it. And that's why I end up spending like 3 hours on these studies, is because you can go on and on. I'm bringing out this line again because I like it design-wise, that it's like it's repeating this shape here. I'm gonna emphasize the parting of her hair a little bit here. There we go. Blend it out, blend it out. Oh, I forgot this shadow across her face. Whenever I get to this point, I get really scared, and I'm pretty sure I've just been putting off doing it because if I make it ugly, then I can't really go back on it. So I'm going to practice in the air a little bit. I want to go like this, go across her face, then just do it. All right, here we go. The least amount of brush strokes I can make, the better. That's not so bad. I'm gonna bring a little bit of cool for her far right side of the face here. And I'm just gonna leave it like that. That's an artistic choice because I don't really see that in the photo. Lastly, just making sure some of the dark edges are dark enough and they're hard enough that they feel like there's structure there. It's usually the undersides of stuff. So the underside of the lip there, underside of the upper lip as well, corners of the mouth. Put a little more emphasis in here. All right, I think that's it. I think I'm physically stepping away from it so that I am not gonna keep painting it. I really like how this study turned out. Let me show you guys in more detail. So yeah, I think this study is rather successful considering I haven't touched watercolors in quite a while. I really like how it turned out. So that is it for today's video. I really hope you guys enjoyed it. I'm really happy with how the study turned out, and I hope you guys got a lot out of it too. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in my next video. Bye!